unanimously as the Republican Party's natural successor to Dwight D. Eisenhower.
His opponent was the Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy.
Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts capped a political career of 6 years in the House of Representatives and nearly 8 years in the Senate.
Typically, Nixon pushed himself to the limit by deciding to campaign in every state of the Union.
It started in August and continued clear through till the election day, and it was punishing all the way. It became particularly hard when he injured his knee in Greensboro, North Carolina, on the door of a convertible.
The knee became infected. Nixon was forced to enter hospital when his doctors told him he might lose the leg.
When he came out of the hospital, he had lost a considerable amount of weight, I'd say about 8 or 10 pounds, and his shirts didn't even fit him.
Still weak, Nixon went on air to debate Kennedy in the first live televised debate between presidential candidates. Millions watched.
The two of us rode over to the studio to do the debate, and as we got out of the car, he bumped his knee again and re-injured the knee, and so I could hear him wince vocally.
Mr. Vice President, you said it was...
He had a hospital pallor, and naturally he had a very heavy beard. He did not use makeup. He just had a light powder put on his beard. The contrast between him and Senator Kennedy was striking. Senator Kennedy was fit, tanned, and our vice president looked like someone who had just got out of the hospital.
The debate damaged Nixon's image, and Kennedy eventually won the election by the very narrowest of margins.
A California primary with national interest is the contest waged by former Vice President Nixon for the Republican nomination for governor. With his wife, Pat...
Determined to re-enter the political arena, Nixon ran for office again in 1962.
This is a critical race for Mr. Nixon. His political life hinges on his success in the race for the governorship.
A retired journalist who I became acquainted with in the early 1980s, Bill Van Petten, told me Nixon was drinking heavily during the campaign, and this was well known to the traveling press corps and his staff.
John Ehrlichman was a close aide of Nixon's. Before his death, he worked closely with a filmmaker, Mark Barnett.
When John would talk about Nixon's drinking, he said that it wouldn't take much to get Nixon high. 1 or 2 drinks would be it. He couldn't hold his liquor.
On election night in November, Nixon watched the results in his hotel room. By midnight, it was clear he would lose.
He'd been up all night watching the returns come in, and he'd been drinking, and he was not at his best. He was on his way from his room to the car, and he was going down a hallway, and he looked through a door, and here was Herb Klein having a press conference.
I heard some applause going across the lobby, and I announced that he left the hotel. Next thing I knew, he was tapping me on the shoulder and taking over the microphone.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
That was a time when I think I saw my father coming out of my brother, reacting, well, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because that was the kind of thing my father would have said. The gracious reaction my mother might have had would have been to say, well, I wish the new governor well.
For once, gentlemen, I would appreciate if you would write what I'm saying.
His wife, Pat, bore the brunt of his disappointment.
And Bill said at that time, that day, that next night, Nixon again was drinking, and he had badly beaten Pat Nixon. She had been beaten to such a degree that she then went into seclusion.
Later, Pat sought advice on a divorce from a lawyer, Waller Taylor.
He was the family lawyer in the early 60s, and he did mention this to me at one point. She had come to him and said she'd had her eyes blackened or an eye blackened or something, and wanted to find out what it would take to get a divorce. But as it seemed, that all passed.
Dr. Hutschnecker confided to one of his acquaintances that once again Nixon had turned to him for help.
He'd been advising or tending to the needs, the psychiatric needs of Richard Nixon. I said, my word, he must have a lot of troubles. He said, oh yes, he's got lots of emotional difficulties.
The Nixon marriage did survive, and throughout the 1960s Nixon worked on his political comeback. He was determined to run for president again in 1968. Nixon asked Ehrlichman and another key aide, Bob Haldeman, to work on his campaign. Ehrlichman agreed, but only on condition that Nixon promised to stop drinking.
They were the people who he felt could discipline the campaign and could discipline himself, because he knew where he would get too exhausted, or where he would lose his temper, or where sound and fury would overcome mind and discipline.
He wanted a filter, and it was then that I realized his painful shyness. He could blush, and this is a remarkable quality to encounter in a mature politician who's met everybody, done everything, and yet it was engaging because it showed you the vulnerability of this very sensitive human being who was trying to be something that he was not.
Nixon found campaigning very stressful.
I think there may have been some medication to reduce stress, or whatever they call them, tranquilizing and so forth.
The nighttime routine would be late at night, have a drink, take a sleeping pill, like most of us. Nixon would get on the phone, and to me, the conversations were marked by a kind of a drift into a strange and bothersome incoherence, because I would wonder whether the next morning there would be a news release indicating there was some problem with the campaign that he didn't make. He didn't go on to the next stop.
Thanks to a former Wall Street tycoon called Jack Dreyfus, Nixon began to take a new drug that year. Dreyfus was using his considerable wealth to lobby for wider use of Dilantin. Dilantin is only officially approved in the US to treat epilepsy, but Dreyfus claims it can help with anger, stress, and depression.
And he said, could you give me some? And I said, well, it's a prescription medicine. You must get it from a doctor. And he said, well, the heck with the doctors. Anyhow, I gave him the bottle. The bottle contained 1,000 pills at that time. But I realized that if he's running for president, I suppose that if he wanted Dilantin, I could give it to him.
Nixon was already taking sleeping tablets. If Dilantin is taken in combination with these types of drugs or alcohol, or in the wrong dose, the result can be devastating.
You're talking about creating a disastrous situation of mixing drugs that enhance their effect, not knowing what amount you took, not being aware of the safe amount, and then all the side effects that could occur. The delirium, the psychosis, slurred speech, mental confusion.
As Election Day approached, rumors began to circulate that Nixon had been seeing a psychotherapist in New York. Reporters were soon on the trail of Dr. Hutschnecker.
John Ehrlichman confirmed to me before his recent death that he, with Haldeman, knew about Nixon's connection with the psychotherapist Hutschnecker, but were very concerned to minimize it. And as Hutschnecker himself put it, it was safer for a politician to be going to a whore than to be seen to be involved with a psychiatrist.
Nixon's press aide, Herb Klein, visited Hutschnecker to contain the story.
He told me that he had seen Nixon on a number of occasions. He'd come to Washington on some occasions.